One of the most notorious inmates to be executed in Texas was Raymond Hamilton, a member of the Bonnie and Clyde gang. He was a member of the notorious Barrow Gang during the early 1930s. The Barrow Gang was an American gang active between 1932 and 1934. They were well-known outlaws, robbers, murderers and criminals who as a gang traveled the central United States during the Great Depression. Their exploits were known all over the nation. They captured the attention of the American press and its readership during what is sometimes referred to as the Public Enemy era. Though the gang was notorious for the bank robberies they committed, they preferred to rob small stores or gas stations over banks. The gang was believed to have killed at least 9 police officers, among several other murders. By the time Raymond Elzie Hamilton was 20 years old, he had accumulated a prison sentence of 362 years. Raymond Hamilton was born May 21, 1914, in a tent on the banks of the Deep Fork River in Oklahoma. Born near Shelter, Oklahoma, Raymond Hamilton spent his childhood in West Dallas, then one of the worst slums in the entire country. In West Dallas he met Clyde Barrow and formed the Root Square Gang. Nothing serious at first, just petty theft and shoplifting, while they learned their trade. Clyde graduated to car theft and burglaries, while Ray had a flourishing operation stealing cars in Texas and selling them in Oklahoma. Raymond Hamilton was a more gifted criminal than Clyde. His armed robberies netted him more money than most of Clyde's, though still not the big-time hauls of John Dillinger or Harvey Bailey. He also had a slightly smaller predilection for killing people. Unlike Clyde, who was so quick to start shooting that he became known as the Texas Rattlesnake. That's not to say that Raymond Hamilton was a reluctant murderer. He was believed to have several notches on his gun, but had a cooler head than Clyde, although their outsized egos were about the same. Raymond Hamilton soon ended up in the worst prison in Texas, Easton Prison Farm, a prison where Clyde had already served time. Easton was renowned for corruption and brutality. It wasn't just one of the worst prisons in Texas, it was one of the worst in the entire country. Guards routinely brutalized inmates and inmates brutalized each other. The food was inedible, the daily work crippling, discipline was brutal and arbitrary, and many guards regarded cruelty as a perk of the job. Inmates routinely assaulted, raped and murdered each other. Clyde himself became a regular victim of lifer and serial rapist Ed Crowder, who singled him out for regular beatings and sexual assaults. It's said that when Crowder was found bitten to death in the wash house and inmate Aubrey Scally convicted, that Scally had taken the life sentence as a favor to the real murderer, Clyde Barrow. Clyde suffered enough to develop an obsessive hatred of Easton, vowing that he'd never be taken alive, would return to raid Easton and start a mass escape. In 1932 he secured release through an accidental injury when an axe slipped and removed 2 of his toes. Ray didn't plan on staying any longer than he had to, either. The Barrow Gang went their way and Ray went his. He kept a relatively low profile, while Bonnie and Clyde stole and shot their way to immortality. While they increased their body count and racked up a string of small-time robberies, Ray and O'Dar hid in Louisiana, living fairly quietly. After the Barrow Gang murdered yet another policeman, Constable Cal Campbell in Commerce, Oklahoma on April 6, 1934, Ray sent a letter to his lawyer, A.S. Baskett, denying all involvement. Proving the letter was genuine by putting an inky fingerprint on it, the letter claimed Ray now had nothing to do with Barrow and hadn't for some time. According to Ray, he was a gentleman bandit. By implication, Clyde Barrow wasn't. With an ever-increasing list of murders and robberies and a huge, permanent search going on, it was only a matter of time before the end came. Bonnie and Clyde were ambushed and shot to pieces near Gippsland, Louisiana on May 23, 1934. They'd been set up by Henry Methvin's family, hoping to save their son from conviction and execution by trading a pardon for Bonnie and Clyde. Joe Palmer was recaptured in June 1933. So was Ray. They were tried on capital charges, Ray for being an habitual criminal and Palmer for the murder of prison guard Joel Krausen during Clyde's raid on Eastham. They were both convicted, condemned and shipped off to Huntsville prison to await execution. Floyd Hamilton drew 2 years for his role in the Eastham raid, and various Barrow and Hamilton relatives drew smaller sentences for harboring the fugitives. Their run was almost over, but not quite. Raymond Hamilton and Palmer might have been sentenced to die and confined at Huntsville's notorious death house, but they weren't finished quite yet. A lifer, Charles Frazier, wanted to help a friend and condemned inmate named Blackie Thompson escape death row. Few Texas inmates had successfully escaped from Huntsville, and none at all from death row. On June 22, 1934, Hamilton and Palmer would be the first. Knowing a guard who was in serious financial trouble and easily bribed, Frazier managed to have 3 loaded pistols smuggled into Huntsville. Out in the prison yard, Frazier met with fellow lifers Roy Johnson, Hub, Stanley and Whitey Walker. Together they forced their way into the death house and, at gunpoint, forced a guard to open the cells of Thompson, Hamilton and Palmer. Taking hostage guard W.G. McConnell, they used him as a human shield, stole an extension ladder from the prison fire engine, mounted the wall, entered a guard tower, and ran down the outside steps and disappeared into downtown Huntsville. Hamilton, Palmer and Thompson were free. The others had been shot dead or recaptured. Either way, it didn't matter. After being sentenced to die, Ray had proclaimed to reporters that he would escape from the death house. The reporters put it down to criminal bravado at the time, as did the Texas prison system. Ray's boast had now become a fact. For the first time in its history, though not the last, the Texas death house had been successfully breached. This did Palmer no good at all. He was recaptured and returned to Huntsville in early August 1934. Raymond Hamilton lasted until April 1935 before being caught near Fort Worth, Texas, and returned to Huntsville for execution. The Texas authorities were sick of them. Hamilton and Palmer had made 2 successful escapes from maximum security Texas prisons within 7 months, murdered a prison guard, and then secured informal stays of execution by escaping from the death house itself. Authorities had waited long enough to rid themselves of this troublesome pair and, with Raymond now in custody, were in no mood to wait much longer. Both Raymond Hamilton and Palmer would die just after midnight on May 10, 1935. Unlike so many Texas felons whose deaths bear Y-rated a small squib in the Huntsville item, if that, the death chamber was standing room only for Hamilton and Palmer. Neither the Texas courts or state governor were remotely inclined to intervene. As they were already condemned men when they escaped, there was no problem arranging the earliest possible execution date. Ray, always so cocky and arrogant, always needling Clyde about his superior skill and nerve, didn't face his own end quite so bravely. He spent his final day growing progressively more fearful, prison staff fearing he'd have to be carried or manhandled on his final walk. Palmer was calmer and seemed more resigned to his fate. When their time came, Raymond Hamilton broke down. He was so distraught that Palmer, wanting just to get it over with, even volunteered to go first while Ray composed himself. Raymond Hamilton eventually did. Palmer walked calmly into the execution chamber and sat down at 12:01 a.m. Guards moved quickly, securing the straps and electrodes without any resistance, and Palmer was pronounced dead at 12:09 a.m. With Palmer dead, a strong smell of smoke and burned flesh permeated the crowded death chamber. Deputy Warden Joe Bird left back through the little green door separating the chamber from death row. The support act had been and gone, and it was time for the main event. Raymond Hamilton, for so long the cocky, sneering self-proclaimed gentleman bandit, was about to walk his last mile at the tender age of 20. Ray, by now having recovered some of his nerve, walked in at 12:19 a.m. When Bird had walked the dozen steps from the chair to Hamilton's cell, the depression desperado had calmed enough to ask if Palmer dead. On being told so and that it was his turn, just enough of Hamilton's earlier bravado returned. Not much, granted, but enough to see him through to the bitter end. Raymond Hamilton managed a fixed smile and, with very forced casualness, his final words were plain and simple. Well, goodbye all. Raymond Hamilton was dead at 12:27 a.m., at the age of 20. 11 days before his 21st birthday. Thank you for watching Death Row.